I never thought a celebration could become the moment everything fell apart. My husband stood up at our daughter's graduation dinner and delivered an insult so cutting, so public, that the entire table went silent. What happened next changed my life forever. I'm sharing this because maybe you've felt what I felt, that quiet devastation when someone you love tears you down in front of everyone who matters. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe. These stories need to reach the people who need them most, and your support helps make that happen. The restaurant was one of those upscale places in downtown Chicago where the silverware gleams under soft lighting and every dish costs more than I used to spend on groceries for a week. Our daughter Emma had just graduated from Northwestern with honors, and my husband Richard insisted we celebrate at Morton's Steakhouse. He made the reservation himself, chose the wine, even ordered for the table before everyone arrived. I should have known then that something felt off about his enthusiasm. Richard had never been the type to organize family gatherings. That had always been my job, my domain, the invisible labor I performed to keep our family connected. The moment I walked into the restaurant that evening, I felt the weight of expectation pressing down on my shoulders. The hostess, a young woman with perfect posture and a practiced smile, led us through the maze of white-clothed tables. I was acutely aware of the other diners, power couples in expensive suits, business deals being sealed over rare steaks, anniversaries being celebrated with champagne that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. This was Richard's world, not mine. I'd always felt like an imposter in places like this, like someone playing dress-up in clothes that didn't quite fit. I wore my navy dress, the one I'd bought on sale at Nordstrom Rack 3 years ago. It still fit well enough, though I noticed how the fabric pulled slightly at my waist. I'd put on weight over the years, the kind that creeps up slowly when you stop paying attention to yourself. My hair, once a rich auburn, had faded to something between gray and rust. I'd stopped coloring it 6 months earlier, telling myself it was a choice, an acceptance of aging. But really, I just couldn't find the energy anymore. As I smoothed the dress over my hips for the 3rd time, I caught Richard's eyes flicking over me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Disappointment? Embarrassment? Or was I just projecting my own insecurities onto his blank stare? He'd stopped complimenting me years ago, but the absence of criticism had felt like enough. Now, in this glittering restaurant full of polished women in designer clothes, I felt the absence like a physical weight. Emma looked radiant in a cream-colored dress, her blonde hair swept up in an elegant twist. My son Michael sat beside her with his wife Jennifer, and their 2 children squirmed in their chairs, too young to appreciate the occasion. Richard's mother Margaret occupied the seat of honor, her pursed lips and critical gaze sweeping over the table like a searchlight looking for flaws. And then there was her. Vanessa. Richard introduced her as his new executive assistant, barely 28 years old, with dark hair that cascaded down her back and a figure that turned heads as she walked through the restaurant. She wore a red dress that hugged every curve, and when she smiled at Richard, something in my chest constricted. The way she touched his arm when she spoke, the little laugh she gave at his jokes, the familiar ease between them. It all felt wrong, invasive, like watching someone else live in the space I thought belonged to me. I watched as Vanessa settled into her seat directly across from Richard. She had this way of moving, confident, deliberate, occupying space without apology. Everything about her seemed calculated to draw attention. The red dress wasn't just red, it was crimson, the color of fresh blood or expensive wine. Her jewelry was minimal, but clearly expensive. A thin gold chain at her throat, small diamond studs that caught the light when she turned her head. Even her perfume, something musky and sophisticated, seemed to announce her presence before she spoke. "Mrs. Chambers," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand across the table. "Richard talks about you all the time. It's wonderful to finally meet you." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost believed it. But I'd been married to Richard for 30 years. I knew when someone was performing. I shook her hand. Her grip was firm, almost challenging, and forced a smile that hurt my face. "How lovely that you could join us," I managed to say, though every instinct screamed that her presence here was a violation, an intrusion into a family moment. I tried to focus on Emma, on celebrating her achievement, but my eyes kept drifting to Vanessa. She knew things about Richard's schedule I didn't know. She mentioned a client meeting in New York that he'd never told me about. She referenced an inside joke from the office, and Richard laughed in a way I hadn't heard in years, genuine, unguarded, alive. "Remember when the Henderson presentation crashed?" Vanessa said, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "And Richard had to improvise for 45 minutes? Richard leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at his lips. "I thought Johnson was going to have a heart attack. But you pulled it off. You always do." The way she said it, with such admiration, such certainty, it was the way I used to talk about him, back when I still believed he hung the moon. Emma tried to redirect the conversation. "So, Mom, did you finish that book you were reading?" She knew. I could see it in her eyes. The way she was trying to shield me from whatever was unfolding across the table. But before I could answer, Vanessa jumped in. "Oh, do you like to read, Mrs. Chambers? Richard mentioned you used to write." Used to. As if my writing was something dead and buried, a relic from another life, which I supposed it was. "I dabble," I said, my voice tight. "That's so nice," Vanessa said, with the kind of patronizing sweetness that made my teeth ache. "Having hobbies is so important, especially as we get older." We. As if she and I were in the same category, facing the same inevitable decline. She was 28, I was 63. There was no we. When the waiter brought out Emma's favorite dessert, a chocolate soufflé with raspberry coulis, Richard stood up to make a toast. I thought he'd talk about Emma's hard work, her dedication, her bright future. Instead, he raised his glass and said, "To Emma, who proves that success comes to those who refuse to settle. Unlike some people, she knows her worth and won't waste her potential." The table went silent. Emma's smile faltered. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Margaret nodded approvingly, as if Richard had said something profound. "She won't end up trapped in mediocrity," Richard continued, his eyes flicking to me for just a second. "She won't sacrifice her dreams to play small. She's going places." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the heat rise in my face, the blood pounding in my ears. Around us, the restaurant continued its elegant hum, the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. But at our table, there was only silence and the sound of my heart breaking. Vanessa clinked her glass against his, her smile bright and oblivious, or perhaps perfectly aware. I felt the heat rise in my face, the familiar sting of tears threatening to spill. But I'd learned over the years to swallow that feeling, to push it down deep where no one could see it. I raised my own glass with a trembling hand and took a sip of wine that tasted like ash. Emma reached for my hand under the table and squeezed it. "Mom," she whispered, but I shook my head slightly. Not here. Not now. I couldn't fall apart in front of everyone. Couldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Michael's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. He looked at his father with something close to hatred, but Richard seemed oblivious, already moving on to another topic, already forgetting the grenade he'd just lobbed into the middle of our family dinner. The rest of the evening blurred. I smiled when I was supposed to smile, nodded when conversation required it, and excused myself twice to stand in the bathroom stall and breathe through the tightness in my chest. In the mirror, I looked exactly how I felt, old, tired, erased. The woman staring back at me had dark circles under her eyes and lines around her mouth that seemed to have appeared overnight. When had I become invisible? When had I stopped mattering? In the bathroom, I pressed my palms against the cool marble countertop and forced myself to breathe. The fluorescent lighting was unforgiving, showing every flaw, every year, every disappointment etched into my face. My lipstick had worn off, leaving my lips pale and thin. My eyes looked hollow, haunted. I pulled out my compact and tried to fix the damage. But what was the point? No amount of powder could hide what I was feeling. A young woman emerged from one of the stalls, probably in her 30s, beautiful in that effortless way some women have. She washed her hands and caught my eye in the mirror. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. The unexpected kindness nearly broke me. I nodded quickly, not trusting my voice. "Rough night," she pressed. "Family dinner?" I managed to say, and she nodded with understanding. "Those can be the worst. Hang in there." She squeezed my shoulder briefly before leaving, and I stood there wondering when a stranger's kindness had become more comforting than my husband's presence. We drove home in silence, Richard's fingers drumming on the steering wheel to some internal rhythm I couldn't hear. I wanted to ask him what he'd meant by his toast, why he'd humiliated me in front of our family, why Vanessa had been there at all. But the words stuck in my throat like stones. I'd spent so many years swallowing my questions, my hurt, my anger, that I no longer knew how to speak them aloud. The streetlights of Chicago blurred past the window. I watched the city I'd lived in for 30 years slide by like scenery in someone else's life. We passed the coffee shop where Emma and I used to meet for lunch when she was in college. The bookstore where I'd spent countless Saturday afternoons browsing, always leaving with more books than I could carry. The park where I'd pushed my children on swings and taught them to ride bikes. All these places that held my memories, my history, and I felt like a ghost passing through them. At home, Richard went straight to his study without a word. I stood in our kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals, packed countless lunches, cleaned up after family dinners and birthday parties and holiday gatherings. The granite countertops gleamed in the overhead light. Everything looked perfect, ordered, lifeless. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the breakfast nook, staring out at our backyard. The motion sensor light clicked on, illuminating the patio furniture we'd bought when we first moved to this house in Evanston 28 years ago. We'd been young then, full of plans and possibilities. Richard had just started his consulting firm. I'd been working on my novel, a story about a woman who travels across America discovering herself. I had notebooks full of scenes and character sketches, a whole world I'd created in the margins of my days. But then Emma was born, and my writing time became diaper changes and midnight feedings. Michael followed 2 years later, and suddenly I was drowning in the beautiful, exhausting chaos of motherhood. Richard's business took off, demanding longer hours, more travel, constant attention. Someone had to hold the home together, he said. Someone had to be there for the kids, and I was good at it, or at least I convinced myself I was. I threw myself into being the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the woman behind the successful man. My novel sat unfinished in a drawer. The characters I'd created faded like photographs left too long in the sun. I told myself I'd get back to it someday, when the kids were older, when Richard's business stabilized, when life slowed down. But life never slowed down. It just kept moving forward, carrying me along like debris in a current, and I was too tired to swim against it. I'd given Richard everything. When his business nearly failed in the recession of 2008, I'd taken money from my inheritance, the small fortune my father had left me, maybe $60,000 that was supposed to be my safety net, and invested it in keeping his firm afloat. I never asked for it back. I never even mentioned it after the crisis passed and his income grew. When his mother had her stroke 5 years ago, I was the one who moved her into our home, who managed her care, who listened to her criticisms and complaints without protest. I'd canceled my plans, postponed my dreams, shrunk myself smaller and smaller to make room for everyone else's needs. And now he stood in front of our family and friends and told our daughter not to end up like me. I finished my wine and poured another glass. The house felt too big, too quiet, too full of ghosts. Upstairs in the master bedroom, I could hear Richard's voice through the wall. He was on the phone, laughing at something. I wondered if he was talking to Vanessa. I wondered when I'd started wondering things like that. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Richard's steady breathing beside me. He'd come to bed after midnight, smelling of scotch and cologne. He didn't touch me, didn't speak, just settled onto his side of the mattress like we were strangers sharing space in a hotel. I thought about the early years when we'd stay up late talking about our futures. Richard had been so passionate then, so full of ideas and energy. He'd believed in my writing, encouraged me to pursue it. When had that changed? When had he started seeing me as an obligation rather than a partner? Or had I been the one who changed, who'd let myself disappear into the roles of wife and mother until there was nothing left of the woman I used to be? The next morning, Richard left for work before I woke up. I found a note on the kitchen counter. Late meeting. Don't wait up. No signature, no terms of endearment, just a statement of fact. I crumpled the note and threw it in the trash. Emma called around 10. "Mom, about last night." "Your father was proud of you," I interrupted, my voice artificially bright. "That's all that matters." "But what he said?" "He'd had too much wine. Don't worry about it, sweetheart. Focus on your future. You have so much ahead of you." I could hear her hesitation, the unspoken questions hanging in the silence between us. But I couldn't bear to discuss it, couldn't face the pity I knew I'd hear in her voice. "Mom, you don't have to protect him." What he said was cruel, and everyone at that table knew it. "Emma, and Vanessa, why was she even there? Did you know he was bringing her?" The question pierced through my defenses. "No," I admitted quietly. "I didn't know." "There's something going on, isn't there, between them?" I wanted to lie, to protect my daughter from the ugliness of her father's betrayal, but the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the things I couldn't say. "Mom," Emma said, her voice breaking, "you deserve better than this." "I'll be fine, sweetheart. I always am." After we hung up, I wandered through the house like a ghost. In Richard's study, I noticed his laptop was open, the screen dark but not shut down. I'd never been the type to snoop. I trusted him. Or maybe I'd just been too afraid to look for proof of what I already suspected. But something about last night, about the way he'd looked at Vanessa, about the casual cruelty of his toast, pushed me past my fear. I touched the trackpad and the screen lit up. His email was open, the inbox showing dozens of unread messages. My eyes caught on a name, Vanessa Chen. There were multiple emails from her, the most recent from just 2 hours ago. My hand trembled as I clicked on the first message. It was dated from 3 weeks earlier, sent late on a Friday night. The subject line read, "Can't wait for next weekend." I opened it. The words blurred as I read them, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. Vanessa had written about their upcoming trip to New York, how she'd booked a room at the plaza, how excited she was to spend uninterrupted time with him. She referenced previous trips, inside jokes, intimate moments that made my stomach turn. Richard's responses were worse. He called her pet names. He told her she made him feel young again. He complained about his boring life in the suburbs, about obligations that tied him down. He said things about me, about how I'd let myself go, how I'd lost my spark, how he felt trapped in a marriage to someone who'd given up on life. Each word was a knife. I scrolled through the emails mechanically, my hands shaking, tears streaming down my face. There was one where he joked about how I'd stopped trying to be attractive, stopped caring about my appearance. Another where he complained about my mediocre ambitions. In one particularly cruel message, he'd written, "She used to be someone. Now she's just there, like furniture. You don't notice it until you want to replace it." I scrolled through weeks of messages, each one a small knife to my heart. They'd been seeing each other for almost a year. The business trips to New York, to Boston, to San Francisco. They hadn't all been for work. The late nights at the office, the weekend conferences, the unexplained charges on our credit card that he'd brushed off as client entertainment. It all made sickening sense now. In one email, he'd sent her photos from our family vacation to Lake Michigan last summer. We'd rented a cottage, spent a week with Emma and Michael and the grandkids. I'd thought it was a good week, one of the better ones we'd had in years. But Richard had been texting Vanessa the whole time, complaining about being stuck with his family, counting down the days until he could see her again. I remembered that vacation now with new eyes, the way Richard had been glued to his phone, claiming he was dealing with a work crisis. The evening he'd disappeared for hours, saying he'd gone for a walk to clear his head. The distance in his eyes when we'd all gone swimming in the lake, like he was physically present, but mentally somewhere else entirely. I'd attributed it to stress, to the demands of his business. I'd made excuses for him because making excuses was easier than facing the truth. There was one email I couldn't stop reading, sent just 3 days before Emma's graduation dinner. Vanessa had written, "Why don't you just leave her? You know you want to. You deserve to be happy, Richard. You deserve someone who appreciates you." His response, "Soon. I'm working on an exit strategy. The business is doing well. I can afford to walk away. I just need to get my finances in order. Maybe by the end of the year." I sat back in his leather chair, my whole body numb. An exit strategy. He was planning to leave me, to take his money and his young girlfriend and start a new life. And I'd had no idea. I'd been so focused on holding everything together, on being the supportive wife, that I'd missed every single sign. Studies confirm that 65% of all abuse cases involve female victims. I'd read that statistic somewhere, but it had never meant anything to me until now. I'd never thought of myself as abused. Richard didn't hit me. He didn't scream or throw things or threaten me. But what he did was worse in some ways. He erased me. He diminished me. He made me complicit in my own disappearance. I closed the laptop and walked upstairs to our bedroom. In the closet, pushed to the back behind winter coats and old shoes, was a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were my old notebooks, the ones from my novel. I pulled them out and sat on the floor, reading through pages I'd written when I was 25, when I still believed my voice mattered. The protagonist of my story was named Sarah. She was trapped in a small town, suffocating under the weight of expectations and obligations. One day, she just got in her car and drove. She left everything behind and set out to discover who she really was, beneath all the roles she'd played for other people. I'd never finished the story. I'd never found out what happened to Sarah, whether she found herself or just found new ways to be lost. But sitting there on the closet floor, surrounded by the remnants of dreams I'd abandoned, I realized I could still write that ending. I could still become Sarah, could still save her, and maybe, in the process, save myself. That night, Richard came home around 9. He found me in the kitchen making tea, my hands steady as I poured hot water over chamomile leaves. "Rough day?" he asked, loosening his tie. "Not particularly," I said, my voice calm. "How was yours?" "Busy. The Henderson account is being difficult." He opened the refrigerator and pulled out a beer. "Did Emma call? I should probably apologize for the toast. I think it came out wrong." "It came out exactly how you meant it," I said. He looked at me, surprise flickering across his face. I rarely contradicted him, rarely challenged anything he said. "I was trying to compliment Emma," he said, an edge creeping into his voice. "By insulting me in front of our entire family?" "Don't be so sensitive. You're always looking for reasons to be offended." There it was, the deflection, the blame, the way he twisted everything so that my hurt became my fault. I'd fallen for it 1,000 times before, had swallowed my pain and apologized for feeling it, but not tonight. "I saw your emails," I said quietly. The color drained from his face. He set down his beer, his jaw tightening. "You went through my computer?" "You left it open." "So you thought you'd just invade my privacy?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. He'd been cheating on me for a year, planning to leave me, humiliating me publicly. But somehow, I was the villain for discovering it. "How long has it been going on?" I asked. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Richard, please, don't insult my intelligence more than you already have." He was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching mine as if trying to calculate his next move. Finally, he sighed and sat down at the kitchen table. "It's not what you think," he said. "Then tell me what it is." "Vanessa and I, we have a connection. She understands me in a way you haven't in years. She's interested in my work, in my ideas. She makes me feel alive again." "And I don't?" "When was the last time you asked me about my day, about what I'm working on? You're so caught up in running this house, in managing everyone's lives, that you've forgotten I'm even here." The injustice of it took my breath away. I'd spent nearly 3 decades putting his needs first, supporting his career, raising his children, caring for his mother. And now he was blaming me for not paying enough attention to him? "I forgot you were here?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "I've organized my entire life around you being here. I gave up my writing, my career, my inheritance to support your dreams. I've cooked and cleaned and scheduled and sacrificed while you built your fortune, and you forgot I was here? See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. You're always the martyr, always keeping score. I never asked you to give up your writing. That was your choice. You needed someone to raise the children. You needed someone to manage the house while you focused on work. Those things don't happen by magic, Richard. Someone has to do them. And you're going to hold that over me forever? Is that it?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. The man I'd married had been capable of kindness, of consideration, of love. This man, sitting across from me, was someone I didn't recognize. "I'm not holding anything over you," I said. "I'm just trying to understand when I stopped being worth your respect. Maybe when you stopped respecting yourself, when you stopped being the woman I married and became just—" He gestured vaguely. "This." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I felt something crack inside me, but it wasn't the breaking I expected. It was more like a shell splitting open, the beginning of something emerging rather than the end of something dying. "Get out," I said quietly. "What? I want you out of this house, tonight." "You can't be serious. This is my house too. I've paid for with my money," I interrupted. "When your business was failing, I gave you $60,000 to save it, my inheritance. I never asked for it back, never even mentioned it. But I'm mentioning it now. This house exists because of my money and my labor, so yes, I absolutely can tell you to leave." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. "You're being irrational. We should talk about this when you've calmed down." "I am calm, probably calmer than I've been in years, but I'm done. I'm done making myself smaller so you can feel bigger. I'm done being grateful for the scraps of attention you throw my way. I'm done with all of it." "Where am I supposed to go?" "I don't care. Call Vanessa. I'm sure she'd love to have you. Or go to a hotel. Just be gone by morning." I walked out of the kitchen and up to our bedroom, my heart pounding but my steps steady. Behind me, I heard Richard's chair scrape against the floor, heard him call my name, but I didn't turn around. I locked the bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded in my lap. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt powerful. Terrified, yes. Uncertain about what came next, absolutely. But also powerful. Like I'd finally remembered I had a voice, and it was strong enough to say no. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed listening to Richard move around downstairs, listening to him make phone calls in hushed, angry tones. Around 2 a.m, I heard the front door open and close, heard his car start in the driveway and pull away. The house settled into silence, and I cried. Not the silent, swallowed tears I'd trained myself to produce, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook my whole body. I cried for the years I'd wasted. I cried for the woman I'd been before I learned to make myself invisible. I cried for my unfinished novel and my abandoned dreams and the life I'd convinced myself I didn't deserve. I cried until there were no tears left, until I was empty and raw and somehow, inexplicably, hopeful. When morning came, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat in the breakfast nook, watching the sun rise over our backyard. The patio furniture looked shabby in the early light, the cushions faded and worn. Everything needed attention, needed care, including me. I thought about the years I'd spent believing that sacrifice was the same as love, that making myself smaller somehow made the people around me bigger. I'd confused my worth with my usefulness, had measured my value by how much I could give rather than by who I was. But studies reveal that young adults aged 20 to 29 have the highest rate of emotional abuse, nearly 10%. And yet here I was, 63 years old, just beginning to recognize the patterns that had shaped my entire adult life. It wasn't too late. It couldn't be too late. I called Emma that morning and told her everything. She cried with me on the phone, apologized for not seeing it sooner, offered to come over immediately. I told her I needed some time alone, some space to figure out my next steps. She made me promise to call if I needed anything, and I heard the worry in her voice, the guilt. I didn't want her to feel guilty. None of this was her fault. Michael called next, his voice tight with anger at his father. I always knew he could be difficult, but this... Mom, I'm so sorry. Jennifer and I, we're here for you. Whatever you need. The outpouring of support from my children both comforted and embarrassed me. How had I hidden this for so long? How had I convinced everyone, including myself, that everything was fine? Over the next few days, I began the practical work of disentangling my life from Richard's. I found a lawyer. A woman named Patricia who specialized in divorce cases involving significant assets and complex finances. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, and no nonsense, and she didn't mince words. "You're entitled to half of everything," she told me in her office overlooking Lake Michigan. The house, his business, his retirement accounts, everything. Illinois is an equitable distribution state, which means the court will divide assets fairly. And given that you contributed your own inheritance to his business and spent nearly 30 years as a homemaker supporting his career, you have a strong case for a substantial settlement. Patricia's office was all clean lines and minimalist design, a glass desk, modern art on the walls, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the lake that took my breath away. Everything about it spoke of competence and power, qualities I desperately needed someone else to have since I wasn't sure I possessed them myself. "Tell me everything," she said, pulling out a yellow legal pad. "And I mean everything. Every time he made you feel small, every dollar you contributed, every sacrifice you made. The law might deal in facts and figures, but I need the whole story to build your case." So, I told her. I told her about the inheritance, about caring for Margaret, about giving up my writing. I told her about the emails, about Vanessa, about the toast at Emma's graduation dinner. And as I spoke, I watched Patricia's expression harden. "He's a classic narcissist," she said flatly. "And he's been financially abusing you for years, whether you realized it or not. Keeping you in the dark about the finances, making you feel grateful for access to money that was legally yours anyway, that's financial abuse." The numbers she quoted made my head spin. Richard's consulting firm was worth over $3 million. Our house was valued at $800,000. His retirement accounts held another $1.5 million. Half of that would give me financial security for the rest of my life. Enough to live comfortably, to travel, to do all the things I'd postponed. But the conversation with Patricia also revealed something that made my blood run cold. Richard had recently transferred $200,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He'd done it just 3 weeks ago, right before Emma's graduation dinner. "This is classic financial abuse," Patricia said, her expression grim. He was hiding assets in preparation for the divorce he was planning. The good news is, we have evidence of the transfer. The court will not look kindly on this. I thought about Richard's email to Vanessa, about his exit strategy and getting his finances in order. He'd been planning this methodically, moving money, preparing to leave me with as little as possible. The man I'd spent 30 years with had been actively working to ensure my financial ruin. That night, I couldn't shake the image of Richard systematically preparing to abandon me. It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the calculated cruelty of it all, the way he'd planned to leave me destitute after everything I'd given him. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the living room, surrounded by the life we'd built together. Family photos lined the mantel: Emma's graduation from high school, Michael's wedding, the grandchildren's baby pictures. In every photo, I was smiling, my arm around Richard or the kids, the picture of domestic contentment. But looking at them now, I could see the strain around my eyes, the tightness in my smile, the way I always positioned myself slightly behind everyone else, as if I was afraid to take up too much space. There was one photo that stopped me cold. It was from about 15 years ago, taken at a company dinner for Richard's firm. We were dressed formally, standing in front of a Chicago skyline backdrop. Richard had his arm around my waist, but his body was angled away from me, toward his colleagues. I was looking at the camera with an expression that could only be described as resigned. I remembered that night. I'd wanted to stay home, had felt out of place among Richard's business associates, but he'd insisted I come, had said it was important for appearances, and so I'd gone, had smiled for the camera, had played the role of the supportive wife. When had I stopped being a person and become just a role? The doorbell rang, startling me out of my thoughts. Through the window, I could see a car in the driveway, not Richard's. I opened the door to find Margaret, Richard's mother, standing on the porch with her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "May I come in?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. I stepped aside and let her pass. She'd always intimidated me, with her crisp suits and judgmental gaze. Even now, at 84, she carried herself with an authority that made me feel small. "I spoke with Richard," she said, settling herself on the living room sofa without waiting for an invitation. "He told me what's happening, this nonsense about a divorce." "It's not nonsense, Margaret. Don't be dramatic. Every marriage has rough patches. You work through them. That's what adults do. Your son has been having an affair for over a year. He's been hiding money and planning to leave me. That's not a rough patch. Affairs happen. It doesn't mean anything. Men have needs. If you'd been paying attention to him instead of what? Instead of taking care of you when you had your stroke? Instead of raising your grandchildren? Instead of supporting his business and managing his household?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I see. You're going to play the victim. Make yourself the martyr." "I'm not playing anything. I'm just done." "Done," she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Do you know how many women would kill to have the life you have? A beautiful home, financial security, a successful husband. And you're throwing it away over some girl who means nothing. She means enough that he was planning to leave me for her. He'll get over it. They always do. But if you divorce him, you'll regret it. You'll end up alone in some little apartment, living on whatever scraps the lawyers leave you. Is that what you want?" I looked at this woman who'd lived in my home for 5 years, who I'd bathed and dressed and fed when she couldn't do it herself, and I felt nothing but pity for her. She'd spent her whole life believing that a woman's worth came from her husband, that self-respect was less important than maintaining appearances. "I'd rather be alone with my dignity than trapped in a lie," I said quietly. "Dignity?" She laughed, a sharp bark of sound. "Dignity doesn't keep you warm at night. Dignity doesn't pay the bills. Actually, half of Richard's fortune will pay the bills quite nicely." Her face flushed with anger. "You think you're entitled to his money? To the business he built? I think I'm entitled to half of what we built together, and the law agrees with me. I'm warning you, Margaret said, standing up with effort. If you go through with this, you'll lose more than just Richard. You'll lose this family. Michael will have to choose sides. The grandchildren will grow up hearing about how their grandmother destroyed their family over her own selfishness. The threat was clear, and it landed exactly where she intended. My grandchildren. I couldn't bear the thought of losing them, of being cut off from those sweet faces that lit up when they saw me. But then I thought about what I'd be teaching them if I stayed. I'd be showing them that women should accept betrayal and humiliation for the sake of keeping the peace. I'd be telling my granddaughters that their worth came from the men they married, not from who they were as people. I'd be passing on the same poison that had infected my own life. If Michael chooses his father's side, that's his choice, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. But I won't sacrifice myself to prevent it. Not anymore. Margaret stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked out without another word. I heard her car pull away and let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The threats didn't stop with Margaret. Over the next week, I received calls from Richard's business partners, from mutual friends, from people in our social circle who'd apparently decided I was the villain in this story. They told me I was being unreasonable, that I needed to think about the family, that I was too old to start over. One particularly cruel phone call came from a woman named Diane, someone I'd considered a friend for almost 20 years. We'd served on the same charity boards, had attended the same parties, had shared countless lunches discussing our children and our lives. "I just think you're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice syrupy with false concern. "Richard made one error in judgment. It happens. But destroying your marriage over it? That seems extreme." "He didn't make an error in judgment, Diane. He had a year-long affair and was planning to leave me." "Well, maybe if you'd taken better care of yourself, kept yourself interesting, he wouldn't have strayed. I'm not saying it's your fault, but you have to take some responsibility." I hung up on her mid-sentence and blocked her number. I was done listening to people blame me for my husband's choices, done accepting the narrative that I'd somehow driven him to this. But the campaign of social pressure was taking its toll. I found myself second-guessing everything, wondering if I was being too harsh, too unforgiving. The doubts crept in late at night when the house was too quiet and I was too aware of how alone I was. It was my neighbor, Claire, who finally cut through the noise. She was 72, a widow who lived in the house next door with her 3 cats and her extensive garden. We'd been friendly over the years, but never particularly close. She'd always struck me as somewhat eccentric, with her purple-dyed hair and her tendency to speak her mind without filter. She showed up at my door one afternoon with a plate of homemade cookies and a bottle of wine. "I heard what's happening," she said without preamble, "and I think you should know that Richard is a jackass." I laughed despite myself and invited her in. We sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd confronted Richard, and Claire told me about her own marriage. "My husband cheated on me too," she said, biting into a cookie. "About 10 years before he died. I found out because the woman he was seeing showed up at our house one day and told me everything. She thought I knew, thought we had some kind of arrangement. What did you do?" "I stayed, and I regretted it every single day for the next 15 years. I stayed because I was scared, because everyone told me I was too old to leave, because I thought I needed him. But you know what I needed? I needed my self-respect. I needed to look at myself in the mirror without feeling ashamed." She reached across the table and took my hand. "You're doing the right thing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her words, simple and direct, cut through weeks of doubt. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. I was simply refusing to accept being treated as less than human. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the practical aspects of rebuilding my life. Patricia, my lawyer, was methodical and fierce. She documented every instance of Richard's financial misconduct, every hidden account, every suspicious transfer. She prepared a case so solid that Richard's lawyers started making settlement offers before we even got to court. But Richard wasn't done fighting dirty. 3 weeks into our separation, I discovered that he'd been telling people I was mentally unstable, that I'd had some kind of breakdown and was making wild accusations. He implied that I needed help, that I wasn't thinking clearly. The gaslighting extended beyond our marriage into our social circle. Emma called me in tears one afternoon. "Dad's telling people you're having delusions. He's saying you need psychiatric care." "Mom, what do I tell people?" "Tell them the truth. I have emails, bank records, documentation of everything. If anyone wants proof, I'm happy to provide it." Michael was less diplomatic. He showed up at Richard's temporary apartment and confronted him, their argument loud enough that neighbors called the building security. When Michael called to tell me about it, I could hear the pain in his voice. "I don't understand how he could do this to you," Michael said. "To our family. He's acting like you're the problem, like you're the one who destroyed everything." "That's what people do when they're caught," I said. "They rewrite history to make themselves the victim." But the rewriting of history wasn't just coming from Richard. Margaret had apparently decided to launch her own campaign, calling relatives and friends to tell them I'd always been difficult, had always been ungrateful, had never appreciated everything Richard did for me. She painted a picture of me as a bitter, jealous woman who was punishing her successful son for his one mistake. The lies were exhausting to combat. For every person I told the truth, there seemed to be 2 more who'd heard Margaret's version. I found myself excluded from social gatherings, uninvited from events I'd attended for years. The same people who'd smiled and laughed at my dinner parties now crossed the street to avoid talking to me. But something unexpected happened in the midst of the social rejection. I discovered who my real friends were. Claire, of course, stood by me without question. But there were others. Women I'd known casually who reached out with their own stories of betrayal and recovery. Women who'd been through divorces, who'd rebuilt their lives, who understood the particular pain of being erased by the man you'd given everything to. One woman, Susan, had been married to a prominent lawyer who'd left her for his paralegal. She'd been 58 at the time, convinced her life was over. Now, at 67, she ran a successful consulting business and traveled the world. "The first year was hell," she told me over coffee at a cafe in Wicker Park. "I thought I'd never stop feeling angry and betrayed. But eventually, the anger burned itself out, and what was left was this incredible sense of freedom. I could do whatever I wanted. I could be whoever I wanted. I didn't have to shrink myself anymore." Her words resonated with something deep inside me. The freedom to be myself. When was the last time I'd even considered that possibility? I started small. I went to a bookstore and bought 3 novels I'd wanted to read but had never made time for. I took a writing class at a local community center, my first formal instruction in creative writing. I joined a gym not to lose weight or make myself more attractive, but because I wanted to feel strong. The writing class met every Thursday evening in a converted warehouse space in Pilsen. Our instructor, a published novelist named Marcus, was in his 40s with kind eyes and an encouraging teaching style. The class was small, just 8 of us, mostly women, all at different stages of our writing journeys. The first night, Marcus asked us to introduce ourselves and explain what we hoped to get from the class. When it was my turn, I found myself saying, "I used to write. I stopped for 30 years. I want to remember why I loved it." Marcus nodded. "Welcome back," he said simply, and those 2 words brought tears to my eyes. We did writing exercises, shared our work, offered feedback. I was rusty, my prose clumsy at first, but gradually the words began to flow more easily. I wrote about my past, about Sarah and her unfinished journey. I wrote about loss and rediscovery. And in writing about Sarah, I was writing about myself. One of my classmates, a woman named Lauren in her 30s, read a piece about her divorce. It was raw and honest, full of pain, but also hope. After class, I approached her. "That was brave," I said. "Thank you for sharing it." She smiled. It felt good to get it out. Are you going through something similar? And there, in that warehouse space with its exposed brick and industrial lighting, I told her my story. She listened without judgment, nodding at the familiar parts, gasping at the worst moments. "You're going to be okay," she said finally. "I can tell. You're already finding your voice again." And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I started to feel like a person again, rather than just a collection of roles and obligations. But just when I thought things were settling into a new normal, Richard delivered one final blow. It came in the form of a letter from his lawyers, delivered to my door on a gray November afternoon. The letter informed me that Richard was contesting the divorce on the grounds of my mental instability. He'd compiled evidence of my erratic behavior, carefully curated examples taken out of context and twisted to support his narrative. He claimed I'd become paranoid, had made wild accusations, had isolated myself from friends and family. He even included a statement from Margaret backing up his claims. But the worst part was at the bottom of the letter. Richard was seeking full ownership of the house and the business, claiming they were solely the result of his labor and income. He was offering me a settlement of $50,000, a fraction of what I was entitled to, and framing it as generous given my contributions to the dissolution of the marriage. I sat on my living room floor with the letter in my hands, my whole body shaking with rage. He was trying to steal everything. After 30 years of my labor, my sacrifice, my money that had saved his business, he was trying to leave me with nothing. I called Patricia immediately. She read the letter and let out a low whistle. "This is bold, even for him," she said. "But it's also stupid. We have documentation of everything, bank records showing your inheritance going into the business, emails proving the affair and the financial hiding, medical records showing you're perfectly stable. This is a Hail Mary, and it's not going to work." "Then why do I feel like I'm losing?" "Because he's trying to break you down, make you accept whatever scraps he throws your way just to end the pain. That's his strategy. But we're not playing that game." She was right, but knowing that didn't make it hurt any less. I spent that night in a dark place, questioning everything. Maybe I should just take the $50,000 and walk away. Maybe fighting was more trouble than it was worth. Maybe... My phone rang at 11 p.m. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it. "Is this Mrs. Chambers?" a young woman's voice asked. "Yes." "This is Amy. I worked at Mr. Chambers' firm. I heard about what's happening, and I think you should know something." My heart started pounding. "What is it?" "Mr. Chambers has been manipulating the company finances for months. He's been transferring money into personal accounts, hiding income from the business. I have copies of everything. He made me help him do it, and I kept records because I knew it was wrong. I was too scared to say anything before, but now, I can't let him do this to you." We met the next morning at a coffee shop in the Loop. Amy was 24, fresh out of college, with wide eyes that held equal parts fear and determination. She ordered a latte and sat across from me in a corner booth, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out a USB drive. "I've been wanting to do this for months," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I processed another transfer, every time I had to create another false invoice, I knew it was wrong. But I needed the job. I have student loans. My mom depends on me. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I was just following orders." She pushed the USB drive across the table. "But then I heard what he was trying to do to you, claiming you're mentally unstable, offering you $50,000 when the company alone is worth millions. And I couldn't stay silent anymore." The drive contained months of financial records, evidence of Richard systematically looting his own business to hide assets from the divorce, spreadsheets showing legitimate business income being funneled into personal accounts, emails instructing Amy to backdate documents, false expense reports claiming personal purchases as business expenses. It was all there, meticulously documented. "Why are you doing this?" I asked her, my voice thick with emotion. Amy's eyes filled with tears. Because I watched him do the same thing to his first business partner's wife 5 years ago. Her name was Sarah. Isn't that strange? Same name as your character. She ended up with almost nothing because he hid everything. She had to move into a tiny apartment, took a job as a receptionist just to survive. I was an intern then, and I saw the whole thing. I couldn't watch it happen again. Not when I have the power to stop it. I hadn't known Richard had driven a previous business partner out. It was yet another piece of his history he'd concealed from me. Another woman he'd financially destroyed without a second thought. I wondered how many others there had been. How many lives he'd ruined in his climb to success. Patricia reviewed the files Amy provided and called me that evening, her voice vibrating with excitement. This changes everything. He's committed fraud, both in the divorce proceedings and potentially in his business dealings. With this evidence, we can not only get you your full settlement, we can file criminal complaints if we need to. Armed with Amy's evidence, Patricia filed an emergency motion with the court. Within 48 hours, we had a hearing scheduled. The judge reviewed the documentation, looked at Richard and his lawyers with undisguised disgust, and ordered all of Richard's accounts frozen pending investigation. Richard's face went white when the judge spoke. He'd been so confident, so sure he could manipulate his way out of accountability. But the evidence was overwhelming, and his attempts to claim mental instability on my part fell apart under scrutiny. The hearing lasted 3 hours. I sat at the plaintiff's table watching Richard's carefully constructed facade crumble piece by piece. Patricia presented the evidence methodically. Bank statements, emails, Amy's testimony. Richard's lawyers objected repeatedly, but the judge shut them down each time. I've been on the bench for 23 years, the judge said at one point, her voice sharp with disgust. And I've seen my share of people trying to hide assets in divorce proceedings. But this, she gestured at the stack of documents. This is one of the most egregious examples I've encountered. Mr. Chambers, you didn't just hide money from your wife. You committed fraud against your own business, falsified documents, and coerced an employee into illegal activities. And then you had the audacity to claim your wife is mentally unstable? Richard's face had gone from white to red. Vanessa, sitting behind him in the gallery, looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. I'm ordering all of Mr. Chambers' accounts frozen immediately, the judge continued. You will pay Mrs. Chambers' legal fees in full. You will provide complete financial disclosure, and I mean complete, Mr. Chambers. Every account, every asset, every penny. You will submit to a forensic accounting of your business dealings going back 10 years. And if I find out you've hidden one more dollar, I will hold you in contempt and refer this matter to the state's attorney for criminal prosecution. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor, Richard mumbled, barely audible. By the end, Richard had been ordered to pay my legal fees, provide full financial disclosure, and submit to a forensic accounting of all his business dealings. The judge also issued a stern warning about the consequences of perjury and fraud, her words hanging in the courtroom like a final judgment. Outside the courtroom, Richard tried to approach me. We can still work this out, he said, his voice desperate. You don't have to destroy me. I'm not destroying you, Richard. I'm just refusing to let you destroy me. Vanessa was waiting for him by the elevator, her expensive designer clothes and perfect makeup looking somehow less impressive in the harsh fluorescent light of the courthouse. She looked at me with something that might have been pity or contempt. I couldn't tell and didn't care. Was it worth it? I asked Richard. All of this, the lies, the manipulation, the cruelty. Was she worth losing everything? He didn't answer. The elevator doors closed on them, and I turned to Patricia with a feeling of profound relief. The divorce proceedings dragged on for another 4 months, but the outcome was never in doubt. Richard's attempts to hide assets had backfired spectacularly. The forensic accounting revealed even more concealed income, more offshore accounts, more systematic fraud. What he'd thought was his exit strategy became his undoing. The final settlement gave me the house half of his business ownership, and a substantial portion of his retirement accounts. The total came to just over $2 million, enough to secure my future, and then some. Richard was also required to pay a significant sum to cover the taxes on the hidden income, effectively doubling the financial consequence of his deception. But the real victory wasn't the money. It was the fact that I'd stood up for myself, had refused to accept being erased, had fought for my worth when everyone told me to just let it go. The day the divorce was finalized, I drove to the house in Evanston, my house now, and walked through every room. I'd lived here for 28 years, had raised my children here, had built a life here. But it had never really felt like mine. It had always been Richard's house, reflecting his taste, his needs, his vision. I started making changes immediately. The dark, heavy furniture went to auction. The formal dining room with its pretentious crystal chandelier became a bright, airy library. I painted the master bedroom a soft lavender, a color Richard had always hated, and bought myself a new bed, one I didn't have to share with anyone. In what had been Richard's study, I set up my writing space. I brought out my old notebooks, my unfinished novel about Sarah and her journey of self-discovery. I sat down at a new desk overlooking the backyard and opened to a blank page. The words came slowly at first, rusty from years of disuse, but gradually they began to flow. I wrote about Sarah leaving her small town, about the terror and exhilaration of being alone for the first time in her life. I wrote about her mistakes and discoveries, her moments of doubt and triumph. And as I wrote, I realized I wasn't just telling Sarah's story, I was living it. Emma visited often during those first months of my new life. She brought the grandchildren, and we'd spend afternoons in the backyard, planting flowers and making up silly games. She apologized repeatedly for not seeing what was happening, for not standing up to her father sooner. "You couldn't have known," I told her. "I didn't even fully understand it myself until it was over." "How do you do it?" she asked one afternoon as we watched the kids play. "How do you not hate him?" I did hate him for a while. But hate takes too much energy, and I need that energy for other things now. He's their father, their grandfather. I don't have to like him or respect him, but I don't have to waste my life being angry at him either. Michael struggled more with the divorce. He'd been close to his father, had looked up to him. Learning about Richard's betrayal shattered something in him. He stopped speaking to Richard entirely, refused to let the grandchildren see him. "You don't have to do that," I told Michael. "You don't have to choose sides." "He chose his side when he treated you like garbage," Michael said, his jaw tight. "He doesn't get to pretend he's the victim now." I appreciated Michael's loyalty, but I worried about the toll it was taking on him. Anger, I'd learned, was a temporary fuel that eventually poisoned the person carrying it. Margaret, predictably, cut me off completely. She moved in with Richard and Vanessa, a living arrangement I couldn't help but find grimly amusing. She sent me one final letter, full of vitriol and blame, and I read it once before throwing it away. Her words couldn't hurt me anymore. But the biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a call from Amy, the young woman who'd provided the evidence of Richard's fraud. "I thought you should know," she said. "Mr. Chambers fired me after the divorce. He blamed me for everything, but I found a new job, a better one. And I wanted to thank you for showing me that standing up for what's right is worth it, even when it's hard." Her words brought tears to my eyes. I'd been so focused on my own pain and recovery that I hadn't considered I might be an example to anyone else. I started volunteering at a local women's shelter, helping women who were leaving abusive relationships navigate the practical challenges of starting over. Many of them were younger than me, some with small children, all of them terrified of what came next. I shared my story with them, not to make myself a hero, but to show them that it was possible to rebuild, to reclaim yourself, to find joy on the other side of pain. One woman, Maria, was 42 and had been married to a man who'd controlled every aspect of her life for 20 years. She had no credit in her own name, no job history, no confidence in her ability to survive alone. "I'm too old to start over," she told me one afternoon, her eyes red from crying. "I was 63 when I left," I said. "If I can do it, you can do it." Working with these women gave my life new purpose. I wasn't just surviving, I was helping others survive. I was using my pain for something meaningful. A year after the divorce, I joined a writing group that met weekly in a bookstore in Lincoln Park. We'd read our work aloud, give each other feedback, support each other's creative journeys. For the first time in decades, I was surrounded by people who valued me for my words, my ideas, my voice, not for what I could do for them. One of the women in the group, Patricia, not my lawyer, but a poet in her 50s, became a close friend. She'd never married, had spent her life traveling and writing and teaching. She had a freedom I envied and a loneliness she sometimes admitted to feeling. "You have something I'll never have," she told me one evening over wine at her apartment. "You have children who love you, grandchildren, a history. I have my independence, but sometimes I wonder if I missed out. And sometimes I wonder what I could have accomplished if I'd had your independence," I admitted. "I think we all make trade-offs. The key is making sure the trades are worth it." I thought about that conversation a lot in the months that followed. Had my marriage been worth it? I had Emma and Michael, had grandchildren I adored, had experiences and memories that shaped who I was. But I'd also lost years of my life to a man who didn't value me, had abandoned dreams I'd never get back, had accepted treatment I should never have tolerated. The answer, I decided, was complicated. Some of it had been worth it. Some of it hadn't. And maybe that was okay. Maybe life wasn't about making perfect choices, but about learning from the imperfect ones. 2 years after the divorce, I finished my novel. The story of Sarah's journey across America discovering herself had become richer, deeper, more nuanced than anything I'd written in my 20s. I'd lived enough now to understand the complexity of transformation, the way it wasn't a single moment, but a series of small choices that eventually added up to a new life. I sent the manuscript to a few small publishers, not expecting much. But 3 months later, I got an email from an editor at an independent press in Minneapolis. They wanted to publish my book. The advance was modest, $15,000, but the validation was priceless. Someone had read my words and found them worthy. Someone believed my story mattered. When the book was published the following spring, I held a launch party at the bookstore where my writing group met. Emma and Michael came, bringing the grandchildren. Claire was there, and Susan, and Amy, and the women from the shelter, and my writing group friends. Even Patricia, my lawyer, showed up with a bottle of champagne. Vanessa was noticeably absent from my celebration, but I learned from mutual acquaintances that her relationship with Richard had soured. Apparently, once the excitement of the affair wore off, and she was dealing with the reality of Richard's personality, the romance had faded. She'd left him about 18 months after the divorce, moving to New York to take a job with a different firm. Richard, I heard, was living alone in a condo downtown, visiting the grandchildren occasionally, but maintaining a cordial distance from both Emma and Michael. Margaret had moved into a retirement community after a second stroke left her needing more care than Richard could provide. I felt something when I heard these updates, not quite pity, not quite satisfaction. More like a distant acknowledgement that everyone's story continued, that the drama that had consumed my life was just one chapter in an ongoing narrative for all of us. On my 65th birthday, I threw myself a party. Not a quiet dinner or a small gathering, but a real celebration with music and dancing and too much champagne. I rented out a small event space in Wicker Park, hired a DJ, ordered platters of food from my favorite restaurants. I invited everyone who'd supported me through the divorce and the years that followed, not just family, but the women from the shelter, my writing group, the friends who'd stood by me when everyone else turned away. I wore a red dress, the kind of bold color I'd never dared to wear during my marriage. It was vintage, with a full skirt that swirled when I moved, and I paired it with heels that made me 2 inches taller. When I looked at myself in the mirror before leaving the house, I almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked confident, happy, alive. The party was everything I'd never allowed myself to have. Loud music, laughter that echoed off the walls, dancing that was more about joy than grace. Emma gave a speech that made everyone cry, talking about how I'd taught her what strength really looked like. Michael handed me a framed photo of all of us, him, Emma, Jennifer, the grandchildren, and me in the center, smiling wider than I'd smiled in years. I danced until my feet hurt, until the DJ played his last song and the caterers started cleaning up. At one point, surrounded by all these women who'd become my family, I felt a happiness so complete it was almost overwhelming. Claire made a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "To our friend," she said, raising her glass, "who showed us all that it's never too late to find yourself, who proved that courage isn't about being fearless, but about being scared and doing it anyway, who reminded us that our worth isn't determined by how we're treated, but by how we treat ourselves." Looking around the room at these women, my chosen family, I felt a gratitude so profound it almost hurt. These were the people who'd seen me at my lowest and loved me anyway, who'd believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, who'd celebrated my victories as if they were their own. I thought about the woman I'd been at Emma's graduation dinner, sitting in that restaurant feeling invisible and worthless. I thought about how she'd wanted to disappear, to make herself smaller, to accept the crumbs of affection Richard threw her way. And I felt such tenderness for her, such compassion for how lost she'd been. But I also felt proud of her, because she'd found her voice. She'd said no. She'd walked away from everything familiar and comfortable and built something new. She'd saved herself. The money from the settlement sat mostly untouched in investment accounts, growing steadily. I lived simply, comfortably, spending on things that brought me genuine joy rather than things meant to impress others. I traveled some, a trip to Paris to walk the streets Hemingway had walked, a visit to the Grand Canyon that left me breathless with wonder. But mostly, I stayed in Chicago, in my lavender bedroom, in my house full of books and light. I wrote every day, working on a second novel about a group of women who meet at a divorce support group and become each other's family. I continued volunteering at the shelter, watching woman after woman find her courage and walk toward freedom. I spent time with my grandchildren, teaching them to bake and garden, and most importantly, to value themselves. Emma asked me once if I regretted my marriage, if I wished I'd left Richard sooner. "I regret staying as long as I did," I told her honestly. "I regret the years I spent making myself smaller. But I don't regret the marriage itself, because it gave me you and Michael. And everything I went through taught me who I really am. I had to lose myself to find myself." She nodded, understanding in a way only a daughter could. "I'm proud of you, Mom, for what it's worth." "It's worth everything," I said. As I sit here now, writing the final pages of this story, I'm 70 years old. My hair is completely gray, and I've stopped caring about the wrinkles around my eyes and mouth. My body is softer, rounder, marked by years of living, and I'm happy. Not the performative happiness I used to project during my marriage. Not the false contentment I'd convinced myself was enough, but real, deep, authentic joy. I've learned that transformation isn't a destination, but a practice. Every day, I choose myself. Every day, I remember my worth. Every day, I live in the truth rather than the comfortable lie. The most important lesson I can share is this: your value is not determined by how others treat you. It's not measured by how much you sacrifice or how small you can make yourself. Your worth is inherent, unchangeable, yours to claim whenever you're ready. For too many years, I believed that love meant erasing myself, that being a good wife and mother required my own disappearance. But real love, the kind worth having, makes space for both people. It celebrates rather than diminishes. It lifts rather than limits. If you're reading this and seeing yourself in my story, if you recognize the pattern of making yourself smaller to make someone else bigger, I want you to know something. It's not too late. It's never too late. Whether you're 30 or 50 or 70, you can still choose yourself. You can still say no. You can still walk away from situations and relationships that diminish you. It won't be easy. The people who benefit from your silence will fight to keep you silent. They'll tell you you're being selfish, unreasonable, crazy. They'll rewrite history to make you the villain. They'll try to take everything from you. But if you stand firm, if you hold on to your truth, if you refuse to shrink anymore, you'll discover a strength you never knew you had. And on the other side of that fight, you'll find yourself. Not the self you were before the pain, but a new self, forged in fire, unbreakable and free. So here's my question for you. Have you ever felt yourself disappearing in someone else's story? Have you ever made yourself smaller to make someone else comfortable? Let me know in the comments. Your story matters, and sharing it might help someone else find their courage. And if this story touched you, if it gave you something to think about or made you feel less alone, please like and subscribe. These stories need to reach the people who need them most, and every share, every like, every comment helps make that happen. Thank you for listening to my story. Now go write your own ending.